Hello again and good evening. Welcome back to another episode of Minds on Guard, where we are looking at the media and all the ways that it manipulates our thoughts and behaviors. Without too much more introduction, we are continuing to examine this news article discussing the issue of replacing traditional meat with synthetic lab-grown derivatives, or even insect alternatives to traditional meat. So far, this has been an exercise that's mostly been concerned with pulling apart the various manipulative tactics present in the writing itself. We've looked at the ways that the author uses language and the terms that have been employed by the writer to create various types of imagery, which is then used to frame context. Very important that we understand that process. We've looked at a selective narrative creation, and this was done by omitting certain words, thus creating a negative space for the reader to then fill in and conclude from. This is a common occurrence in today's media. We've seen it used to a very high degree in this article so far, particularly in the headline, and in a lot of the ways that they present data. Just numbers being given without any type of source or really even reference to back up or understand how or why the data is being given. This particular tactic, the negative space, to then lead to conclusions on your own, is tricky because it actually leads us to the conclusions that the writer or the speaker desires, rather than allowing for us to come to our own thoughts and decisions about the way things are, or at the very least ought to be. We've also been touching on some of the inherent logical fallacies that are present in the thinking, specifically noticing the underpinning appeals to authority and also emotion. That's a very big one in this. In the last video that I made, I spoke briefly about the apparent macro narrative that's being crafted within this piece of writing. Now, when I say macro, I'm actually referring to what you'd think of as like the larger picture that's being painted here. Something that I want to stress when doing this kind of study, really any study or work of this kind, where we're learning to think better, is that we really need to make every effort to hold the macro context in our view at all times. Something that's super easy, it's like we do this without even thinking about it, that humans do this all the time, is to focus so intently on the small issues and details that surround and permeate through our lives on a moment-to-moment basis. I really do understand the drive to pull our focus in on what's directly in front of us. We all have an innate desire to feel as though we're in control of our thoughts and our lives. That is a large part of what has driven me to keep making these videos. We are called to take every thought captive. And that means each and every moment is a precious opportunity to choose to live in line with the truth of reality, or to kick against it so that we have to fight it or restructure it or reshape it in some way that suits a deeper desire for control. While all that's true, there is a great danger in forgetting that reality is literally everything that is. It's huge. It's so big we don't have words to describe the vastness of reality. So if we make the mistake of living and behaving exclusively out of the myopic sort of micro context of what we're able to control, or at least perceive that we have control over, we are actually dooming ourselves to disregard the overwhelming majority of life. This is extremely dangerous. It has a lot of danger within it if we continue to live in these ways, and the outcropping effects are felt at the deepest levels of human life. It does ultimately surpass the physical, and becomes a spiritual matter when we examine the depths to which this thinking error of focusing solely on the micro context, when we really examine the effects that this has. This particular subject is a discussion that I want to continue in many future videos, but for now, we actually can use the article that we're currently examining to sort of point to what I mean when I'm talking about this, forgetting the macro, or at least forsaking the macro for the micro context. So let's read a bit more. This next portion is a continuation of the reasoning by the purported expert in the field of biochemical engineering and food science technology. Quote, "The professor from NTU's School of Chemical and Biomedical Engineering pointed out that a number of people still rely on traditional farming to earn a living. So, if you want to introduce alternative meats as total replacements, it's very disruptive, and we're not ready yet, because the cost is not there. The taste is not there. The cost of cultivating meat in laboratories," Professor Chen added, "is also currently exorbitant due to the fetal bovine serum used to produce the meat. The serum extracted from calf fetuses costs approximately $2,000 US per liter. The serum is taken from an unborn calf in the womb, which is later killed, presenting ethical issues." He says, quote, "If we want to promote increased consumer buying of these novel foods, taste is one thing, second is cost. So as the saying goes, taste is king, price is queen," Professor Chen said. So, what kinds of thinking do we see present within these quotes? Where is our professor focusing his opinions and his research? Are we able to identify the things that he sees as top priorities within these statements? The main thing I notice is the emphasis on costs, but there's a very specific filter in place regarding what costs are most important to consider. Notice that we see monetary and sensory costs, speaking to the taste issue, with another very interesting take on specific ethical concerns. As in previous argument given by our expert professor, certain costs are omitted. Why is this the case? Why are the costs of overall nutritional quality of these synthetic meats not mentioned? There is mention to the cost of the livelihoods of the farmers, but what does that play out like in real life? What does it look like? We're actually not told. It's just sort of thrown out there and then we move on. So what I wish to point out here is that there is a macro level worldview narrative being painted, or at least held, at what I see to be a subliminal level. As a society, we've been exposed to this specific narrative crafting for decades, if not far longer. And I'm actually referring to the dehumanization, objectification, and ultimately commodification of people, such that we're stripped of the very things that make us human and connect us to the truth of creation as it has been designed by God. I discussed this in one of my introductions to Wilhelm Wundt, John Dewey, and the shifts in the modern education system. This particular article, I see it to be a prime example of where the sort of outcropping ideas such as the experimental psychology of Wundt and his ideas of humans not possessing anything that could be called, like a soul, where that ultimately leads to. If this sounds like alarmist and like a really large jump in logic, I would ask to consider what the omission of the human cost in the article actually betrays from a philosophical perspective. It's very postmodern, it's very materialistic. I grant that this is really quite subtle and buried deep in the nested layers of this writing, yet I argue that there is an underlying worldview that has been adopted here, where technological innovation is seen as far more valuable and worthwhile than preserving the things that connect us to creation in ways that allow both humans and the planet to survive. This is sort of kicking up against a political issue that I hesitate to dive into too deeply at this stage, but the global warming issue is going to have to be addressed at some point within this article. Later, when we get into the insect replacements, that's going to be something that I'm at least going to touch on and mention there. But with this emphasis on technology, sort of a technological driven future, what does it say about the priorities of a society when financial inputs and the sensory experience of the taste of food are considered over and above the impact to, say, people's health, well-being, and the means of providing for themselves? How often are we forced to choose between the lesser of two evils in today's world? What kind of society are we actually living in when this is the norm? More and more I see the creeping shift away from a firm grounding in the truth of reality and the fact that humans have been given dominion over it to subdue it and use the creation to benefit all of life, and an ever-growing usurpation of that truth such that it benefits those that would seek to distort reality in ways that serve their own desires for power and control. It is this macro issue that I see present within this article, and to be frank, it saddens me. When we strip humans of their spiritual essence, we wrench them from the divine referential of God, and we rob ourselves of our imaging status. There's a lot that goes into that. We'll get to it at some point. What is left is a sack of meat that has no more intrinsic value or worth than, say, a chicken or even just a bag of apples. And this kind of materialism is very dangerous, and I see it as one of the most serious problems in the world today. We cannot continue to think about ourselves in purely physical terms. Every human life is far more valuable and worth far too great a price than to simply be cast off as some sort of accounting issue to be solved during the Great March toward progress. It's interesting to note that there are, in this article, apparent ethical concerns with killing an unborn cow, yet the cost of human life in these experimental technologies are not given this same consideration. This article is awash with the philosophy of the progressive ideologues who think humans are actually a plague upon the earth. And if you think I'm making too much of this, then I would ask you to consider why you may think that. It's good to pose some questions like, how do you value people? By what standard do you hold others with respect to their inherent value, like as people? Do you think you empathize well with others? Can you put yourself in the shoes of other people when these sort of broad sweeping societal level changes are being proposed? Have you ever objectified another person? What does that say about how you view people? So I've had to ask myself these kinds of questions and deal with the consequences of my thinking. What I found was really quite shocking, and it disturbed me greatly. My own objectification of others was part of the journey that has led me to speaking about it here. And I understand how difficult and painful it can be to realize and then have to account for the darker aspects of ourselves. I encourage everyone watching this to step boldly onto the path of telling the truth of our attempts to break reality and dominate the world, however this manifests. It can happen in many both overt and very subversive ways. And this is what I actually see happening at like a very deep philosophical level within the article that we've been examining. It's proposing a future where the truth of reality, the things that we have long established as the most beneficial ways to thrive and live on this planet, are being actually attacked and trying to be done away with. So my goal is to actually call it out when I see it happening in both myself and the world around me. I do believe and I know that it's only by telling the truth and by laying the sins of our just desires to dominate and control reality at the foot of Christ's cross that we may begin to heal, let go of those desires, and come into alignment with the truth that He's ordained from the beginning. The worldview that exists in this article and much of the mainstream media today is one where humans have no hope and cannot ever have any value above just simply the dust in the ground. To me, I see that there is an ideology at work where we as humans must set aside our individual value and allow those who say they know more, that have more, and have stolen as much power from us as possible to rule over our petty little lives while we thank them for the privilege. I say that we have value and life in the truth of Christ. I say that we let that be what informs our thinking, our logic, and our reasoning, so that we may guard our minds against the things of this world that would enslave and destroy us. So until next time, I hope you all stay safe, I hope you all take care of one another, and I hope you stay diligent and vigilant with your minds on guard.